Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Janmadhyasya yato nivayati taradas chante suabhigyasvara.
Janmadyasya yatam vayaritaratascha swabhigyaswara.
Tene Brahma Hridaya Adhikavaye Muyanti Atsuraya.
Tene Brahma Urdaya Adhikavaye Mujanti Jasuraya.
Tejo Varimedam Yata Vinimayo Yatra Trisargo Misha.
Tejo Varimrida Jata Vinimajo Jatra Trisago Mrisya.
Damna Svena Sada Nirasta Kuhakam Satyam Param Dimahi.
Dhamna Svena Sada Nirasta Kuhakam Satyam Param Dimahi.
O my Lord Sri Krishna, son of Vasudeva.
O my Lord Shri Krishna, son of Vasudeva.
O all-pervading personality of Godhead.
O all-pervading personality
I
of
offer my
God.
respectful obeisances unto you.
I offer my respectful obeisances unto
I
you.
meditate upon Lord Sri Krishna because he is the absolute truth.
I meditate upon Lord Shri Krishna because he is the absolute
And the
truth
primeval cause of all causes.
and the primeval cause of all causes
Of the creation, sustenance, and destruction of the manifested universe.
of the creation, sustenance, and destruction of the manifested
He
universe.
is directly and indirectly conscious of all manifestations.
He is directly and indirectly conscious of all manifestations.
And he is independent because there is no other cause beyond him.
And he is independent because there is no other cause beyond him.
It is he only who first imparted the Vedic knowledge unto the heart of Brahmaji,
It is he only who first imparted the Vedic knowledge unto the heart of
the original
Brahmaji,
living being.
the original living being.
By him, even the great sages and demigods are placed into illusion.
By him even the great sages and demigods are placed into
As one is
illusion.
bewildered by the illusory representation
As one is bewildered by the illusory representations
of water seen on fire or land seen on water.
of water, sand, fire, land, sea, and water.
Only because of him do the material universes,
Only because of him do the material universes,
temporarily manifested by the reactions of the three modes of nature,
temporarily manifested by the reaction of the three modes of nature,
appear factual, although they are unreal.
appear factual, although they are unreal.
I therefore meditate upon him, Lord Sri Krishna,
I therefore meditate upon him, Lord Shri Krishna,
who is eternally existent in the transcendental abode,
who is eternally existent in the transcendental abode,
which is forever free from the illusory representations of the
Which-
material world.
which is forever free from the illusory representation of the
I
material
meditate
world.
upon him, for he is the absolute truth.
I meditate upon him, for he is the absolute truth.
Dharma projita kaitravota,
Dharma prujita kaitavutra,
paramo nirmatsaranam satam,
paramo nirmasaranam satam,
vedyam vastavam vastu,
vedyam vastavamashtra vastu,
shivadam tapachoyonmulana.
shivadam taputramemulanam,
Srimad Bhagavate Mahamuni Krite,
Srimad Bhagavate Mahamuni
Kim
Krite,
Vapurer Ishwaraha,
Kimva Paririshvaraha,
Sadyo Hridi Avarudyate Tra,
Sadyurudya Varudya Titra,
Kriti Bihi Sususabhistakshana.
Krituvi Sishustakyana,
Completely rejecting all material activities completely rejecting all spiritual activities which are materially motivated.
completely rejecting all religious activities which are materially
This
motivated.
Bhagavata Purana propounds the highest truth,
This Bhagavad Puran propounds the high truth,
which is understandable by those devotees who are fully pure in heart.
which is understandable by those devotees who are fully pure in their heart.
The highest truth is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all.
The highest truth, the reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all.
Such truth uproots the threefold miseries.
Such truth uproots the threefold
This
miseries.
beautiful Bhagavatam compiled by the great sage Vyasadeva in his maturity
This beautiful Bhagavatam compiled by the great sage Vyasadeva in his maturity
is sufficient in itself for God realization.
is sufficient itself for God realization.
What is the need of any other scripture?
What is the need of the other scripture?
As soon as one attentively and submissively hears the message of Bhagavatam,
As soon as one attentively, submissively hears the message of
by
Bhagavatam,
this culture of knowledge,
by this culture of
the
knowledge,
Supreme Lord is established within his heart.
the Supreme Lord is established within his heart.
Nigama kapataror galitam phalam,
Nigama kalpatoro galitam phalam.
sukhamukad amrita dravya samyutam,
Shuka mukhadamrita drava
pibata
sangitam.
Bhagavatam rasamalayam,
Pibata Bhagavatam
ahor
rasamalaya.
ahoraska bhuvibhavakaha.
Muraho rasika bhuvi
O
bhavuka.
expert and thoughtful men relish Srimad Bhagavatam,
O expert and thoughtful men, relish Srimad Bhagavatam,
the mature fruit of the desired tree of Vedic literatures.
the mature fruit, the desired tree of Vedic
It
literature.
emanated from the lips of Sri Sukadeva Goswami.
It emanated from the lips of Sri Shukadev Goswami.
Therefore, this fruit has become even more tasteful.
Therefore, this fruit has become even more tasteful.
Although its nectarian juice was already relishable for all,
Although its nectarian juice was already relishable for all,
including liberated souls.
including liberated souls.
Shinvatam Swakata Krishna.
Shramvantam Swakata Krishna.
Punya Shravana Kirtana.
Punya Shravana Kirtana.
Idyantakstohi Bhadrani.
Hridyanto Sihabhadrani.
Vidunati Suhitsatam.
Vidunati Suritsatam.
To hear about Krishna from Vedic literatures,
To hear about Krishna from Vedic literature,
or to hear from him directly through the Bhagavad Gita,
or to hear from me directly from the Bhagavad Gita,
is a self-righteous activity.
it is self-righteous activity.
And for one who hears about Krishna,
And for one who hears about Krishna,
Lord Krishna who is dwelling in everyone's heart,
Lord Krishna, who is dwelling within everyone's heart,
acts as a best-wishing friend,
acts as his best wishing
and
friend,
purifies the devotee who constantly engages in hearing of him.
and purifies the devotees who constantly engage in hearing of him.
Nastapresu bhadresu
Nasta Praesha Bhadrishu
nityam bhagavata sevaya
Nityang Bhagavata Sevaya
bhagavati uttamasloke
Bhagavati Tamasloke
bhaktir bhavati naistiki.
Bhaktir Bhavati Naistikhi.
In this way, a devotee naturally develops his dormant transcendental knowledge.
In this way, the devotee naturally develops his dormant transcendental
As
knowledge.
he hears more about Krishna from the Bhagavatam
As he hears more about Krishna from the Bhagavatam
and from the devotees,
and from the devotees,
he becomes fixed in the devotional service of the Lord.
he becomes fixed in devotional service of the Lord.
Tadarajastamo bhava
Tadarajastam Obhava
kamalobhadayaschaye
Kamalobhadayaschaye
cheta etar anavidam
Chaitaitaranavidam
stitvan sattve prasidati.
Sitam Sattve Prasidati.
By development of devotional service,
By development of devotional service,
one becomes freed from the modes of passion and ignorance,
one becomes freed from the modes of passion of ignorance,
and thus material lust and avarice are diminished.
and thus material lust and avarice are diminished.
Evam prasanna manaso
Evam prasanna manaso
bhagavat bhakti yogataha
Bhagavat Bhakti
bhagavat
Yoga
tattva vijnanam
Bhagavat Tattva
mukta
Vijnanam
sangasya jayate.
Mukta Sangasya Jayate.
When these impurities are wiped away,
When all these impurities are wiped
the
away,
candidate remains steady in his position of pure goodness,
the candidate remains steady in his position of pure goodness,
becomes enlivened by devotional service,
becomes enlivened by devotional
and
service,
understands the science of God perfectly.
and understands the science of God perfectly.
Vidyate hridaya grantis,
Vidyate Hridaya Granthis
chidyante sarvasamsaya,
Chidyante Sarvasamshaya
shiyante tasya karmani,
Chiyante Sat Karmani
drishta evat maniswari.
Drusta Idvadmaneshwari.
Thus, Bhakti Yoga severs the hard knot of material affection
Thus Bhakti Yoga serves the hardness of material
and
affection,
enables one to come at once to the stage of samsayam samagram,
enables one to come at once to the stage of Samshayam Samagram,
understanding of the supreme absolute truth personality of Godhead.
understand the supreme absolute truth personality of Godhead.
Therefore, only by hearing from Krishna or from his devotee in Krishna consciousness
Therefore, only by hearing from Krishna or from devotees in Krishna consciousness
can one understand the science of Krishna.
can one understand the science of Krishna.
Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 19, verse number 12. Sukho paviste svatate subhuya
Sukho paviste swatate shubhuya
krita pranama swachikir sitam yat.
Krita pranama swachikir sitam yat
Vignapayam asavivikta cheta
Vigyapayam asha vivikta cheta
upastito gre prigrihita pani.
Upasthito gre bhigrihita pani.
Translation by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. After all the rishis and others had seated themselves comfortably, the king, humbly standing before them with folded hands, told them of his decision to fast until death. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Although the king had already decided to fast until death on the bank of the Ganges, he humbly expressed his decision to elicit the opinions of the great authorities present there. Any decision, however important, should be confirmed by some authority. That makes the matter perfect. This means that the monarchs who ruled the earth in those days were not irresponsible dictators. They scrupulously followed the authoritative decisions of the saints and sages in terms of Vedic injunctions. Maharaj Parikshit, as a perfect king, followed the principles by consulting the authorities even up to the last days of his life. Srila Prabhupada ki. This is an extremely important point. Any decision, however important, should be confirmed by some authority. That makes the matter perfect. So, most people make up their minds and don't always check with some authority what they think about the decision. And that opens the possibility of getting a deeper insight whether that decision is right or wrong. And this is a very important point. Prabhupada says, this means that the monarchs who ruled the earth in those days were not irresponsible dictators. An irresponsible dictator thinks he has absolute power. Any decision he makes, people should accept it. It's my way or the highway, as they say. But that will not give consistent good results, because it's always good for a leader to be advised by bona fide brahmanas and Vaishnavas. Whenever there is an important decision to be made, consultation with superior devotees and superior authorities is always welcome for a person who wants to be a good leader. And either you're leading yourself or you're leading others, but you have to get validation of your thoughts or your desires or your proposed actions to be safe. And this is explained by Prabhupada in Bhagavad Gita and in Srimad Bhagvatam. In Bhagavad Gita, we've discussed this before, 18th chapter, 57th and 58th verse. Prabhupada says, one should, however, note that after doing something whimsically, he should not offer the result to the Supreme Lord. That sort of duty is not in the devotional service of Krishna consciousness. One should act according to the order of Krishna. This is a very important point. That order of Krishna comes through disciplic succession from the bona fide spiritual master. Therefore, the spiritual master's order should be taken as the prime duty of life. If one gets a bona fide spiritual master and acts according to his direction, then one's perfection of life in Krishna consciousness is guaranteed. And then Prabhupada says, in the next verse in the purport, one should note very carefully that one who is not active in Krishna consciousness is losing himself in the material whirlpool, in the ocean of birth and death. No conditioned soul actually knows what is to be done and what is not to be done. But a person who acts in Krishna consciousness is free to act because everything is prompted by Krishna from within and confirmed by the spiritual master without. So this is Krishna consciousness. This is what we should always do so that we don't make a mistake and go off the rails of Krishna consciousness. There are two rails of Krishna consciousness, Guru and Krishna. So they're parallel rails. Just like in railroad tracks, you have two parallel rails. And as long as they're perfectly parallel, the train moves in a specific direction without faltering. As soon as there's some discrepancy in being parallel, the train can go off the rails and crash. So, therefore, when they build the train tracks, they have to be extremely careful that there's no discrepancy, that the rails are perfectly parallel. Sometimes you have unirails, just one rail. It's a little safer. So when you want to derail a train, you put some obstacles on the tracks, or you damage the parallel nature of the tracks, and then the train just goes off the rails, and there's a crash. So this is also explained in another place, Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada says, first canto, 7th chapter, 5th verse, he says, okay, 1 second, 5-7, he says, it's 175, I'm sorry. Yeah. He says, the contingent soul gets a taste for hearing about the Lord, and by such hearing only he is gradually elevated to the platform of respect, devotion, and attachment for the Lord. The whole thing is completed by the surrendering process. Herein also the same suggestion is made by the Lord in his incarnation of Vyasadeva. This means that the conditioned souls are being reclaimed by the Lord both ways, namely by the process of punishment, by the external energy of the Lord, and by himself as a spiritual master within and without. Within the heart of every living being, the Lord himself, as the supersoul, or Paramatma, becomes the spiritual master. And from without, he becomes the spiritual master in the shape of scriptures, saints, and initiating spiritual master. This is still more explicitly explained in the next sloka. Well, in the next sloka, 176, Krsna says, well, in the purport, Prabhupada writes, he writes, it is a great transcendental science, he's talking about Srimad Bhagavatam, and begins with the process of hearing and chanting the name, fame, glory, etc. of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Revival of the dormant affection or love of Godhead does not depend on the mechanical system of hearing and chanting, but it solely and wholly depends on the causeless mercy of the Lord. When the Lord is fully satisfied with the sincere efforts of the devotee, he may endow him with his loving transcendental service. But even with the prescribed forms of hearing and chanting, there is at once mitigation of the superfluous and unwanted miseries of material existence. Such mitigation of material affection does not wait for development of transcendental knowledge. Rather, knowledge is dependent on devotional service for the ultimate realization of the supreme truth. So, this is a very profound statement. So, on one level, Prabhupada says that the revival of dormant affection for love of God does not depend on the mechanical system of hearing and chanting, but it solely and wholly depends on the causeless mercy of the Lord. So that's the point, that we may be following all the rules and regulations and chanting 16 rounds and minimum 16 good rounds and attending class. But ultimately, everything depends on whether the Lord is fully satisfied with our sincere efforts of practicing Krishna consciousness. And then he says, he may endow the devotee with his loving transcendental service. However, then he says, but even with the prescribed forms of hearing and chanting, there is at once mitigation of the superfluous and unwanted miseries of material existence. So that's another important point. Like, even though we may be mechanically chanting and hearing out of a sense of duty, still there are results, positive results. And one result is there's relief from the onslaught of the modes of material nature, and good and bad results in our activities. We get relief from the good and bad. That's why Prabhupada says good and bad results in the material world are all bad, because either way you have to take birth to either suffer the bad results or to enjoy the good results. So therefore they're both bad. The only solution is transcendental activity, or akarma, and doing that not mechanically only, but with a sense of affection and love for the Lord, where we do it even better. So there's a mechanical way of doing things, and there's the same thing done, imbued with love and devotion and affection for the Lord, that becomes transcendental. So that love and affection, that soft heart, that constant acceptance of one's subordinate position and humility, and not being disturbed either by good or bad results, all these things are pointing to pure devotional service. So knowledge is dependent on devotional service for ultimate realization of the supreme truth. It's not an academic process. Okay, so these are important points for us to imbibe by hearing regularly. Now, we've read this before, but when you hear it in different contexts, it becomes more relevant. It becomes more fixed in the mind. So, therefore, yesterday we were talking about the verse, Yasyaham anagrinan nami harishe tadanam sanera. That is, Krishna says that his special mercy for a devotee is shown when he gradually deprives the devotee of his wealth. Then the relatives and friends of such a poverty-stricken man abandon him. In this way, he suffers one distress after another. Well, like I said yesterday at the end, you shouldn't be afraid of this. It's going to happen to everybody. What happens when you die? You lose everything, right? Everything material that you accumulated. So either it happens at death or it happens before death, but it's going to happen, right? When Krishna says that he gradually deprives him of his wealth, one time I was speaking with this devotee lady. She's not like completely committed, but she comes to the temple every once in a while. She's a nice lady, and she's a psychiatrist, and works for the state of Washington. And I asked her once, I said, well, you see a lot of people who are having mental problems. What do you think is the cause of it? And she said, well, most of the time, they have something they're very attached to, and they're losing it slowly. She said, that makes them go crazy. I said, what happens if they lose it right away, abruptly? He said, that also makes them go crazy, but losing it slowly is even worse. So when you see things, falling apart little by little, and there's nothing you can do to stop it, right? Sometimes it makes people go crazy. Right? So, therefore, here Krishna says, I gradually deprive him of his wealth. So when you see your 401k and your savings diminishing little by little, and there's nothing you can do to stop it, it creates a lot of anxiety. So anyway, here now you know you shouldn't feel bad about that. It's probably something good, because it makes you more dependent. It should make you more dependent on Krishna. You shouldn't become angry at Krishna. Say, oh, I'm chanting my rounds every day. How come you did this to me? Well, wait a minute. It happened to Lord Ramachandra also. It happened to Parikshit Maharaj. It happened to, at one point, to Prahlad Maharaj and to Dhruva Maharaj. So let's not be misled by it. Therefore, it says that we'll pick up where we left off yesterday. There's a very nice verse, 10th canto, 10th, Srimad Bhagavatam 10:87-40, which says, when a person realizes you, meaning Krishna, he no longer cares about his good and bad fortune arising from past pious and sinful acts, since it is you alone who control this good and bad fortune. Such a realized devotee also disregards what ordinary living beings say about him. Every day he fills his ears with your glories, which are recited in each age by the unbroken succession of Manu's descendants, and thus you become his ultimate salvation. And this is a very profound verse. And the purport also is very profound. And the purport says, text 39, the verse before this one, clearly states that impersonalistic renunciants will continue to suffer birth after birth. In other words, the impersonalists will not really get the relief that they're looking for, and they'll suffer birth after birth. That means that even though they may go back, they may merge into Brahman, they're going to come back again because they have incomplete knowledge. Such a realized devotee also so it says, one may ask if this suffering is justified, since a renunciate's status should exempt him from suffering, whether or not he has a devotional attitude. Okay, so one may ask if this suffering is justified, since a renunciant's status should exempt him from suffering, whether or not he has a devotional attitude. So in other words, it's saying, if these impersonalists are who are renounced completely from material sense gratification, are going to suffer birth after birth, then you would think that because they've given up sense gratification, they would be free of suffering. But no, it's not enough to be simply renounced from material activities and material sense gratification. One also should develop a devotional attitude of love and affection for the Lord. Otherwise, the whole spiritual process is not completed or doesn't achieve its goal. As the Shruti mantra states, Esa nityo mahima, Ramanasya na karmana vardate no kanyan. The perpetual glory of a Brahmana is never increased or diminished as a result of any of his activities. Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad 4.4.28. To counter the objection thus raised, the personified Vedas offer this prayer. You can tell in a sense how this purport is not exactly, it's written by devotees and not Prabhupada himself, because it gets a little too technical, right? Whereas Prabhupada's writing is straightforward. You don't have to sit down and say, what does this mean exactly? But anyway, still, I'm not saying what they're writing is wrong, but I'm just pointing out a little difference between Prabhupada's purports and his devotees' purports, because he didn't finish the entire Bhagavatam. The devotees had to finish it, right? He came up to the 10th canto, but just the beginning of it, and he stopped because, and that doesn't mean it's incomplete. Everything was complete before, but the devotees finished it, and to their credit, they did a pretty good job. So now it says, and they're going to repeat this prayer from the personified Vedas, and it says, impersonalistic jnanis and yogis do not qualify for full relief from the reactions of karma. Oh, now that's easily understandable. A privilege reserved only for those who are tvad avagami, pure devotees constantly engaged in hearing and chanting topics concerning the personality of Godhead. The devotees hold firm to the Supreme Lord's lotus feet by their unrelenting Krishna consciousness, and so they need not strictly adhere to the ritual commands and prohibitions of the Vedas. They can fearlessly ignore the apparent good and bad reactions of the work they do only for the Supreme Lord's pleasure, and they can equally ignore whatever others may say about them, whether praise or condemnation. A humble Vaishnava absorbed in the pleasure of Sankirtana, glorification of the Lord, pays little heed to praise of himself, which he assumes mistaken, and happily accepts all criticism which he deems appropriate. Wow, and that's completely opposite of how people react normally. When people criticize them, they get really upset. And when people glorify them, they say, hey, they're right. But this is different. And this is why it says that it's almost impossible for a person engaged in sense gratification, or it is impossible for a person engaged in sense gratification to understand spiritual knowledge. The purport continues. One receives the authorized chanting of the Supreme Lord's glories by faithfully hearing from the sons of Manu. Who are the sons of Manu? It's the disciplic succession of saintly Vaishnavas coming down through the ages. So that's the Brahma Sampradaya. These sages emulate well the example of Swayambhuva Manu, the forefather of mankind. So emulate means they perform in a similar way, or they understand in a similar way. Ayatayamas tasyasam. Although Swayambhuva's life gradually came to an end, his long life, consisting of a Manvantara era, which is like approximately 72 cycles of 4 ages. Each cycle of 4 ages, 4,300,000 years. So therefore, multiply that by 72, so you see each Manvantara avatar lives a very long time. Consisting of a Manvantara era, which was not spent in vain, since he always engaged in hearing and contemplating, writing down, and chanting the pastimes of the Lord. This is Swayambhuva Manu. That's Bhagavatam 3.22.35. And then the purport continues. Even if a neophyte devotee falls from the standards of proper behavior by the force of his past bad habits, the all-merciful Lord will not reject him, as Lord Sri Krsna states. And now, it's another quote. For those who live in Bhadra Krishna, the district of Mathura, I am the object of all worship. Even if the residents of that place fail to properly cultivate the religious principles that one should observe in the Holy Land, they still become devoted to me just by virtue of living there. Even if Kali, the present age of quarrel, has them in his grip, they still get credit for living in this place. My devotee who lives in Mathura is just as dear to me as you, Lord Brahma, and your sons, Rudra and his followers, and the goddess Shri or Lakshmi, and my own self. So this is a verse from Gopala Tapani Upanishad. It continues. Sridhar Swami prays, O Madhava, please let me understand you so that I will no longer experience the entanglement of material pleasure and pain. Or else, just as good, please give me a taste for hearing and chanting about you. In that way, I will no longer be a slave to ritual injunctions. Okay, so this is a little bit technical in the way they're presenting, but it still makes a lot of sense. That is, there is a saving grace by regularly hearing and chanting the glories of the Lord, but hearing and chanting bona fide prayers. So there's so many bona fide prayers in Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagvatam, spoken by pure devotees, just like the Brahma Samhita. And there is the different Gitas in the Srimad Bhagavatam, right? Spoken by great devotees. Like you have the Gopi Gita, right? And then you have the instructions by Maitreya Muni to Vidura. And so there are many places in the Bhagavatam that there are transcendental prayers. We don't have to make any up. You just repeat these transcendental prayers. They're full of potency to purify someone's heart. Just like the glorification, the Yudhisthira glorifies Krsna. And Prahlad Maharaj also glorifies the Lord. In fact, before someone asks something of the Lord, first they glorify him. So therefore, all these people, Dhruva Maharaj and so forth, they all chant these wonderful prayers. Those are the prayers that we should repeat. And then, therefore, first canto, 9th chapter, 15th and 16th verse, and it says, "Oh, how wonderful is the influence of inevitable time. It is irreversible. Otherwise, how can there be reverses in the presence of King Yudhisthira, the son of the demigod, controlling religion? Bhima, the great fighter with a club, and the great bowman Arjuna with his mighty weapon Gandiva, and above all, the Lord, the direct well-wisher of the Pandavas." And the purport, Prabhupada writes, "As far as the material or spiritual resources were required, there was no scarcity in the case of the Pandavas. Materially, they were well equipped because two great warriors, namely Bhima and Arjuna, were there. Spiritually, the king himself, or Yudhisthira, was the symbol of religion. And above all of them, the personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, was personally concerned with their affairs as the well-wisher. And yet, there were so many reverses on the side of the Pandavas. Despite the power of pious acts, the power of personalities, the power of expert management, and the power of weapons under the direct supervision of Lord Krishna, the Pandavas suffered so many practical reverses, which can only be explained as due to the influence of Kala, inevitable time. Kala is identical with the Lord himself, and therefore the influence of Kala indicates the inexplicable wish of the Lord himself. There is nothing to be lamented when a matter is beyond the control of any human being." So, Kala is the inexplicable wish of Krishna himself. Now, this is a fantastic point. This is something materialists can't understand. They look at it and say, "This is a bunch of gibberish. I don't understand what he's talking about here." And even if I did understand, it doesn't make sense. Right? What does this mean? You know, Krishna is the best friend of Pandava, and they still suffered. But that's not spiritual life. Spiritual life means you shouldn't suffer at all. Everything should be rosy, pink and rosy. No. As long as we're in the material world, there are going to be reverses. But the devotee is not disturbed by them. The devotee is not, that doesn't hinder the devotee in his intense pursuit of hearing and chanting and serving the Lord. So, therefore, Yes, there are going to be inexplicable situations beyond our control. What are you going to do with that? Well, some people go crazy. They get panic attacks, and they become fearful. And any little thing can set them off into a panic attack. Right? That's because they don't have faith in Krishna. That's because they haven't heard this and explained by Prabhupada. So therefore, there's no reason to have a panic attack. There's no reason to have mental problems if you believe in Krishna. And if you have full faith, and he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and nothing can happen without his sanction. And the next verse, 1:9:16 says, O king, no one can know the plan of the Lord, Sri Krishna, even though great philosophers inquire exhaustively. They are bewildered. Amen. That's a fact. Everyone's bewildered. Where did COVID come from? What happened to Trump's magnificent economy? It went up into smoke in 3 weeks. After 3 years of building it up, it evaporated in 3 weeks, right? So there's some plan of the Lord here. This is unbelievable, right? But no, it's not unbelievable. It's predictable. Just like the Bitcoin is worth, I bought it when it was only worth, $10, and now it's worth $10,000. And then 1 week later, it crashed. It's not even worth 2 cents. You see, that's material life. So when it was worth $10,000, you're holding one coin. It's $10,000. It's the power. You got the power in your hand. That Bitcoin that's worth $10,000, and all of a sudden it's worth $2. You see, this is material life. There's a plan behind all of this. What's the plan? We should surrender completely to the Lord. Accept everything that happens as the mercy of the Lord. O king, no one can know the plan of the Lord Sri Krishna. Even though great philosophers inquire exhaustively, they are bewildered. The bewilderment of Maharaj Yudhisthira over his past sinful acts and the resultant sufferings, etc., is completely negated by the great authority Bhisma, one of the 12 authorized persons. Bhisma wanted to impress upon Maharaj Yudhisthira that since time immemorial, no one, including such demigods as Shiva and Brahma, could ascertain the real plan of the Lord. So what can we understand about it? It is useless also to inquire about it. Even the exhaustive philosophical inquiries of sages cannot ascertain the plan of the Lord. The best policy is simply to abide by the orders of the Lord without argument. The sufferings of the Pandavas were never due to their past deeds. The Lord had to execute the plan of establishing the kingdom of virtue. There's a saying, virtue always triumphs over evil. Or, one who has done good is never overcome by evil. Nahi kalyana krit kashit durgatim tatagacchati. So these are proverbs right from the Vedas that we should teach our kids, and we should abide by them also. We should learn them ourselves. Right? The sufferings of Pandavas were never due to their past deeds. The Lord had to execute the plan of establishing the kingdom of virtue. That means you can't have Duryodhana as the king. You have to have Yudhisthira as the king. But to do that, there had to be a terrible war. And therefore, his own devotees suffered temporarily in order to establish the conquest of virtue. That's a nice phrase, the conquest of virtue. It's usually the conquest of evil. Bhismadeva was certainly satisfied by seeing the triumph of virtue, and he was glad to see King Yudhisthira on the throne, although he himself fought against him. Even a great fighter like Bhisma could not win the battle of Kurukshetra because the Lord wanted to show that vice cannot conquer virtue. There it is. Vice cannot conquer virtue, regardless of who tries to execute it. Bhismadeva was a great devotee of the Lord, but he chose to fight against the Pandavas by the will of the Lord, because the Lord wanted to show that a fighter like Bhisma cannot win on the wrong side. Now, this has huge implications, what we just read. Huge implications in the practical lives of us and people. Let's think about this. Let's meditate upon this and talk about it some more. It's a very interesting subject. What is it? It's vice cannot conquer virtue, although in the short term it looks like it. In the long term, bad guys don't win. If you're on the wrong side, you can be a good person, but if you're on the wrong side, you're also going to lose. All these are big, big points. You have to think about it. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Any questions? Haribol. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. We got enough proverbs for about for hundreds and thousands of cookies. Would they